70 million years ago, in the fading twilight of the Mesozoic era, the world was a greenhouse of suffocating humidity and relentless heat. The continent of North America was split in two by the vast shallow waters of the western interior seaway, creating a long, isolated landmass in the west known to modern science as Laramidia. This was a world defined by its staggering extremes, a landscape of towering coniferous forests, sprawling coastal plains, and dense swamps that choked the edges of the ancient sea. In the heart of this primordial wilderness, the air was heavy with the scent of decaying ferns, blooming angiosperms, and the sharp tang of stagnant mud. The silence of the early morning was profound, broken only by the occasional hum of massive prehistoric insects and the distant resonant calls of duck-billed hadrosaurs echoing through the mist. Through this cathedral of ancient green, a predator moved with a haunting grace that defied its immense size and catastrophic power. It was a tyrannosaur, sharing the unmistakable bloodline of absolute terrestrial dominance. This creature was the undisputed monarch of the dry land, a marvel of evolutionary engineering perfectly adapted to sit at the apex of the terrestrial food chain. Its legs were massive pillars built for explosive bursts of speed. Its heavy skull was a vault of bone, housing jaws lined with dozens of serrated teeth, each the size of a banana, capable of punching through solid bone and shearing flesh with terrifying ease. It possessed binocular vision, its forward-facing eyes analyzing the environment with a predatory calculus that left no room for escape. For millions of years, its ancestors had known no equal. They walked with the absolute confidence of those who never needed to look over their shoulders. But on this seemingly ordinary morning, as the massive theropod approached the murky edge of a coastal estuary to slake its thirst, a profound and entirely unfamiliar sensation flickered through its primitive nervous system. It was an ancient, primal instinct, a whisper of extreme caution encoded deep within its brainstem. It was the chilling sensation of fear. Before we wade deeper into these treacherous ancient waters, before we uncover the identity of the phantom beast that haunted the nightmares of the greatest predator to ever walk the earth, allow me to introduce myself. I am Frank, the archaeologist, your quiet guide through the darkest corridors of deep time and the forgotten chapters of our planet's incredibly vast history. I want to take a brief, gentle moment to mention that according to our recent analytics, exactly 71.9% of the people watching these historical explorations are not subscribed to the channel yet. If you find yourself captivated by the mysteries of the deep past, if you enjoy letting the noisy modern world fade away entirely as we journey together into the shadows of prehistory, please consider taking a moment to subscribe. It is a small gesture that helps this channel immensely, allowing me to continue bringing these contemplative stories to life for you week after week. Thank you sincerely for your presence and support. And now, let us return to the muddy edge of the Cretaceous swamp, where the undisputed king of the land is about to discover the violent limits of its own sovereignty. The tyrannosaur lowered its massive, heavily armored head toward the water. The surface of the estuary was like a mirror of dark glass, perfectly reflecting the canopy of drooping ferns and the hazy colors of the morning sky. To the untrained observer, the swamp appeared entirely lifeless and serene. The water was stagnant, disturbed only by the occasional bubble of marsh gas rising from the decaying organic matter buried in the mud below. But the tyrannosaur hesitated, its massive frame freezing in place. Its olfactory bulbs, among the largest and most sophisticated of any terrestrial animal in the history of the planet, processed the complex chemical signatures carried on the damp breeze. It smelled the expected scents of wet earth and distant herd animals, but it also registered something completely different. It detected a subtle, overwhelmingly musky odor that spoke of immense hidden bulk resting just below the surface. The king of the land took a cautious step backward, its heavy, three-toed clawed feet sinking slightly into the soft mud of the shoreline. It let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that resonated at a frequency so impossibly deep it could be felt more than heard, a vibration that physically shook the leaves of the nearby ferns. The dinosaur was attempting to intimidate the water itself, demanding that whatever unseen force lurked beneath the dark surface reveal itself. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The swamp remained deceptively still, locked in a tense, breathless silence that stretched across the geological instant. And then, the water exploded. It did not merely splash, it erupted violently upward, a catastrophic geyser of mud, water, and prehistoric fury. From the black depths of the quiet estuary, a jaw of absolutely incomprehensible proportions lunged toward the Tyrannosaur's face. The sheer kinetic energy of the launch was staggering, displacing thousands of gallons of heavy water in a fraction of a second. Before the agile, incredibly fast theropod could properly react, before its powerful legs could propel it backward out of the immediate danger zone, the massive jaws clamped shut with the sickening sound of a falling redwood tree. The force of the impact was utterly devastating, a crushing pressure that defied all biological imagination. This was not the slicing, bone-shearing bite of a fellow theropod dinosaur. This was a blunt, catastrophic compression, a vice grip designed by millions of years of evolution not merely to wound, but to hold, to anchor, and to drag the victim down into the suffocating darkness of the aquatic realm. The Tyrannosaur, a majestic creature that weighed several tons and stood taller than a modern two-story house, was suddenly reduced to the pathetic role of helpless prey, struggling in vain against a monstrous force that pulled it relentlessly into the deep. We must now, gently, let that violent moment fade into the mists of deep time. The frantic struggles eventually subsided, the turbulent water calmed and returned to its glassy state, and the relentless, uncaring march of geological eons erased the estuary, the swamp, and the majestic creatures that fought and died upon its ancient shores. The soft mud turned to hard shale, the shifting sands turned to solid sandstone, and the massive continents drifted across the face of the globe in their agonizingly slow, inevitable tectonic waltz. The lush, humid greenhouse world of the late Cretaceous gave way to the cooler, significantly drier climates of the Cenozoic era. The endless forests retreated, vast grasslands emerged. Ice ages came and went in a rhythmic planetary pulse, and the majestic reign of the dinosaurs was forgotten by the conscious universe. We must travel forward through 70 million long, quiet years of absolute silence, crossing the vast, almost unimaginable chasm of deep time to arrive in the desolate, sun-baked landscapes of what is now the North American Southwest. Imagine a vast landscape of eroded badlands, a harsh, unforgiving terrain of exposed rock and sparse vegetation, where the brutal heat of the summer sun beats down mercilessly on the cracked ancient earth. It is here, in the geological formations of places like Texas and Montana, that the terrifying secrets of that ancient swamp were finally, painstakingly brought into the light of the modern sun. In the late 20th century, meticulous paleontologists, laboriously scouring these vast fossil beds, began to notice a peculiar and deeply unsettling pattern hidden within the stone. Among the scattered mineralized remains of the great Cretaceous megafauna, they were discovering the bones of tyrannosaurs, This in itself was a magnificent career-defining discovery, as any single fragment of these apex terrestrial predators is a treasure of immense scientific value. But as these patient researchers carefully brushed away the hardened sediment of millions of years, slowly revealing the fossilized bone beneath, they discovered something that fundamentally challenged their entire understanding of the prehistoric hierarchy. On the leg bones, the pelvises, and the tail vertebrae of these supposedly invincible theropods, they found distinct massive bite marks. These were absolutely not the superficial scratches of a small scavenger, picking desperately at a carcass long after the giant animal had perished from disease or old age. The pathology of the fossilized bone, preserved perfectly across the eons, told a much darker, much more violent story. The marks were profound, crushing gouges that had permanently deformed the dense bone tissue itself, clearly indicating that the massive bites were inflicted with a level of kinetic force that was almost beyond mathematical calculation. Furthermore, and most astonishingly, some of these fossils showed clear signs of extensive bone healing. The living bone had actually attempted to knit itself back together over the shattered margins of the massive wounds, which meant one astonishing, indisputable thing. The Tyrannosaur had been fully alive when the bite occurred, and it had miraculously survived the terrifying encounter, carrying the aching scars of its trauma for the rest of its natural life. The scientific community was suddenly presented with a profound mystery. What could possibly inflict such catastrophic, overwhelming damage on the most formidable, heavily armed predator of its time? The marks did not match the dental anatomy of another competing tyrannosaur. When massive theropods fought each other over territory or mates, their highly serrated blade-like teeth left distinct narrow slices in the bone, looking exactly like the strike of a heavy, sharpened axe. But these wounds were entirely different. They were blunt, crushing indentations created by massive conical teeth that were specifically built to withstand immense pressure without shattering. They were deep puncture wounds designed to grip relentlessly and crush entirely, not to slice and tear. To identify the mysterious culprit, scientists had to become temporal detectives, matching the forensic evidence preserved in the stone to the anatomical profiles of the other creatures that shared the lush coastal ecosystems of Laramidia 70 million years ago. They had to look beyond the terrestrial realm entirely, beyond the familiar, well-studied roster of horned ceratopsians and heavily armored ankylosaurs, and turn their attention to the dark, murky waters of the ancient estuaries and swamps. There, perfectly hidden in the extensive fossil record, they found the absolute only suspect capable of committing such an act of spectacular, overwhelming violence. They found the fossilized remains of a crocodilian so massive, so absolutely terrifying in its physical proportions, that its very existence seems like a mythical exaggeration of nature. Its scientific name translates perfectly to the absolute horror it represented in life: the terrible crocodile. It was a stealthy beast that lurked quietly in the shallows, a masterful product of evolution designed for ambush that possessed a bite force that significantly eclipsed even that of the mighty tyrant lizard king itself. The shocking discovery of these healed bite marks on tyrannosaur bones instantly shattered the comforting illusion of the dinosaur's absolute terrestrial invulnerability. It revealed a complex world where even the absolute apex of the terrestrial food chain had to approach the water's edge with a deep, instinctual, terrifying reverence. It conclusively proved that the king of the land was, in fact, just another potential, highly nutritious meal for the true silent monarch of the dark swamps. This incredible scientific revelation invites us to pause, breathe deeply, and reflect on our own deeply ingrained perceptions of power, supremacy, and vulnerability. We are deeply conditioned, perhaps by our own evolutionary history, as fragile primates navigating a wildly dangerous world, to categorize nature into neat hierarchical boxes of strong and weak, of predator and prey, of untouchable kings and lowly subjects. We look at the reconstructed towering skeleton of a massive theropod dinosaur, standing tall in a museum hall with its imposing stature and its massive jaws, and we instinctively anoint it as the supreme, unchallenged ruler of its ancient domain, an invincible force of nature that moved through its world without experiencing a single moment of fear. But the vast, indifferent reality of nature does not care for our simplistic human concepts of royalty or absolute supremacy. The fossil record, in its quiet, stony, undeniable truth, reminds us that vulnerability is a truly universal condition of biological existence. Every single living thing, no matter how physically magnificent, no matter how heavily armed or fiercely evolved over millions of years, is fundamentally bound by the relentless constraints of its ecology and the unpredictable chaos of the natural world. The tyrannosaur, for all its evolutionary brilliance, was ultimately an animal of mortal flesh and blood, subject to gnawing hunger, subject to debilitating injury, and ultimately subject to the terrifying unseen forces that lurked just beyond the safe boundaries of its preferred habitat. The profound realization that this mighty creature felt genuine fear, that it hesitated nervously at the water's edge, that it bore the physical scars of desperate struggles for its own survival, does not diminish its majesty in the slightest. On the contrary, it makes the ancient long-dead beast profoundly more real, infinitely more complex, and in a strange, echoing way, far more relatable to our own fragile existence. As we prepare to delve much deeper into the anatomy, the ecology, and the awe-inspiring reality of the massive beast that truly ruled the Cretaceous waters, let this image settle quietly into your relaxing mind. Imagine the shadowy swamps of a world that no longer exists, a world where the boundary between solid land and dark water was a literal line of profound danger, and where even the greatest monsters to ever walk the earth knew, deep in their bones, that there were darker, older terrors waiting patiently just beneath the calm surface. To truly understand the profound nature of the monstrous aquatic entity that commanded such absolute, instinctual respect from the apex predators of the late Cretaceous, we must mentally travel backward even further into the unfathomable depths of geological time. Long before the very first true dinosaur ever stood upon its hind legs, long before the iconic silhouettes of the Jurassic giants began to slowly cast their massive shadows across the ancient ferns, the distant ancestors of this aquatic sovereign had already carved out their grim dominion in the primordial waters of the Triassic period, well over 240 million years ago. While the dinosaur lineage embarked on a frantic, dazzling explosion of extreme morphological diversity, continuously experimenting with massive long necks, elaborate bony crests, complex feathered displays, and bipedal speed, the crocodilian lineage chose an entirely different evolutionary philosophy. They discovered a physical form so brutally efficient, so exquisitely adapted to the fundamental physical realities of the boundary between solid land and deep water, that the merciless engine of natural selection effectively decided to leave them fundamentally unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. This is not evolutionary stagnation. This is the ultimate pinnacle of biological perfection. It is the silent, cold triumph of a design that transcends the shifting epochs. surviving apocalyptic mass extinctions that would repeatedly wipe the terrestrial slate completely clean. Before we delve deeply into the terrifying anatomical specifics of this ancient survivor, I want to gently pause our journey through the deep currents of time. I am Frank, the archaeologist, and it is a profound privilege to be your quiet guide through these forgotten, shadowed realms of our planet's incredibly vast history. As we explore these deep prehistoric mysteries together, I want to kindly mention that exactly 71.9% of the brilliant minds who watch these contemplative journeys have not yet subscribed to the channel. If you are finding solace and profound fascination in these explorations of deep time, if this quiet space helps you disconnect from the frantic pace of the modern world, please consider taking a brief moment to subscribe. Your support is the vital lifeblood that allows me to continue unearthing these magnificent stories and bringing them to you in this tranquil, meditative space week after week. Thank you sincerely for your presence. Now, let us sink beneath the dark, still surface of the Cretaceous waters and examine the absolute nightmare that awaited any creature foolish enough to underestimate the quiet swamp. The creature that lunged from the murky depths of Laramidia was scientifically designated as Deinosuchus, a taxonomic name derived from ancient Greek that translates with chilling accuracy to the terrible crocodile. To merely call it a crocodile, however, is a profound disservice to its staggering, almost incomprehensible scale. Imagine, if you will, a modern American alligator, a formidable and terrifying predator in its own right. Now, in your mind's eye, slowly scale that creature up until it reaches a length of 33 to 40 feet, approximately 10 to 12 meters from the tip of its broad, heavily armored snout to the end of its incredibly powerful muscular tail. This aquatic titan possessed a physical mass that comfortably exceeded 8.5 metric tons, making it significantly heavier and far denser than a large adult African elephant, and crucially, vastly heavier than the tyrannosaurs that patrolled the dry land above. Its entire body was a masterpiece of heavily armored aquatic siege engineering. Its broad back was entirely covered in massive, interlocking bony plates known to science as osteoderms. These thick, deeply pitted shields were not merely passive defensive armor designed to deflect the desperate thrashing bites of giant prey. They were heavily vascularized, filled with a complex network of blood vessels that allowed the giant reptile to rapidly absorb the intense thermal energy of the Cretaceous sun, acting as biological solar panels that fueled its cold-blooded metabolism before it slipped silently back into the suffocating darkness of the deep, cool water. But the true terrifying majesty of the terrible crocodile resided at the very front of its massive bulk. The skull of a fully grown adult measured over 6 feet in length, a solid, heavy vault of dense bone specifically designed to withstand kinetic forces that would instantly shatter the skulls of almost any other known terrestrial animal in Earth's history. The snout was incredibly broad and heavily reinforced, completely unlike the narrow, delicate jaws of modern fish-eating crocodilians. This was a jaw built specifically for catastrophic, overwhelming structural damage. Modern biomechanical analyses utilizing advanced computer modeling and the physics of living tissues have meticulously calculated the bite force of this ancient monster, and the resulting numbers completely defy human comprehension. The jaws of Deinosuchus were capable of snapping shut with a crushing pressure exceeding 23,000 pounds per square inch. To put that staggering, horrifying figure into a proper perspective, the bite force of a modern saltwater crocodile, the strongest of any living animal today, is roughly 4,000 pounds per square inch. The mighty Tyrannosaur, long celebrated for its bone-crushing capabilities, maxed out at approximately 8,000 pounds per square inch. The terrible crocodile hit nearly 3 times harder than the undisputed king of the dinosaurs. When those massive jaws closed around the dense leg bone of a 3-ton hadrosaur or the heavily muscled thigh of a young tyrannosaur, the bone did not merely break. It explosively pulverized into microscopic fragments under the unbearable localized pressure, instantly crippling the massive prey and ensuring that absolutely no terrestrial strength could ever pull it free from the crushing, watery embrace. Furthermore, the terrible crocodile possessed a sensory apparatus that made it a master of its dark aquatic domain. Dotted across the heavy scales of its massive snout were thousands of tiny, highly specialized biological structures known as integumentary sense organs. These microscopic biological sensors were more acutely sensitive to pressure and vibration than the fingertips of a human being. Through these tiny black dots, the giant crocodilian could literally feel the water around it. Even while resting completely blind in the pitch-black darkness of a moonless night, submerged beneath the muddy surface, it could detect the infinitesimal ripples caused by a single drop of water falling from a fern frond, or the gentle, hesitant splashing of a dinosaur tentatively approaching the riverbank to drink from dozens of meters away. It was a biological radar system of unparalleled precision, allowing the massive beast to calculate the exact size, weight, and trajectory of its potential prey without ever opening its eyes or breaking the stillness of the surface. Yet, the most terrifying aspect of this prehistoric leviathan was not its immense physical size, its astonishing sensory network, nor was it the mathematical absurdity of its bite force. It was the creature's profound absolute patience. The terrestrial dinosaurs were creatures of high metabolic demand, characterized by constant, frantic motion. They were driven by a relentless, burning internal fire that demanded vast amounts of caloric fuel, forcing them to continuously migrate, hunt, forage, and fiercely defend their sprawling territories. They lived loud, highly visible lives in the harsh glare of the prehistoric sun. The giant crocodilian, however, was an entity of profound, almost geological stillness. Because of its massive bulk and incredibly slow, cold-blooded metabolism, an adult could theoretically survive for many months, perhaps even a full year, on a single, substantial kill. It did not need to relentlessly patrol the humid forests or chase down fleeing herds across the open coastal plains. It simply had to sink into the murky, heavily vegetated waters of the brackish estuaries, leaving only the tiny, raised mounds of its nostrils and its cold, unblinking eyes breaking the glassy surface. It became a living, breathing part of the landscape itself, indistinguishable from a massive submerged log or a muddy sandbank. It understood, with an ancient, instinctual certainty encoded in its DNA over hundreds of millions of years, the most fundamental rule of terrestrial biology. Eventually, no matter how powerful, no matter how heavily armored, no matter how fast or how ferocious, absolutely everything must come to the water to drink. This biological reality creates a profound philosophical paradox, a deep meditation on the illusion of power and the inevitability of vulnerability. The tyrannosaur, for all its spectacular adaptations, for all its terrifying speed and its own devastating bite, was ultimately a prisoner of its own internal biology. Thirst is the great equalizer of all terrestrial life, a relentless biological ticking clock that slowly but surely drives every living creature toward the dangerous boundary between the solid earth and the fluid abyss. The terrible crocodile did not need to hunt the king of the land. It only needed to quietly wait for the king's own basic biological needs to deliver it directly to the slaughter. In this dynamic, we witness a stunning inversion of the traditional predator and prey hierarchy. The creature that completely commands the land is fundamentally dependent on the realm commanded by another. It is a sobering, deeply calming reminder that true, absolute power does not always roar from the mountaintops or display itself in flashy, high-energy pursuits. Sometimes, true power is utterly silent. It is heavy, it is submerged, and it is infinitely patient. It is the profound ability to wait, motionless and entirely unseen, while the frantic, noisy world of the surface tires itself out and ultimately surrenders to its own inevitable needs. The terrible crocodile did not need to conquer the prehistoric forest. It simply owned the single resource that the forest could absolutely not survive without. As we slowly contemplate the immense silent power of this ancient, perfectly evolved survivor, let us allow its profound patience to gently wash over our own restless, anxious minds. We live our modern human lives at the frantic, high metabolic pace of the terrestrial dinosaurs. We are constantly moving, constantly consuming, constantly reacting to the immediate, overwhelming stimuli of our bright, noisy world. We rarely allow ourselves the profound luxury of complete, absolute stillness. We forget the deep, ancient peace that can be found in simply waiting, in allowing the turbulent currents of the world to flow around us without constantly struggling against them. Imagine the profound tranquility of resting in the cool, dark water, supported entirely by the gentle, effortless buoyancy of the ancient river. Imagine feeling the slow, heavy, rhythmic beat of a heart the size of a boulder, a heart that beats only a few times a minute, measuring time not in frantic seconds or stressful hours, but in the slow, inevitable turning of the seasons and the vast, quiet shifting of the geological epochs. Let the image of the frantic, noisy world above the surface slowly fade away into the distant prehistoric mist. Focus only on the quiet, heavy darkness of the water. Feel the cool mud beneath you, anchoring you safely to the ancient earth. There is no need to run, no need to fight, no need to anxiously anticipate the future. The water provides everything, and the water demands absolutely nothing but your quiet, steady presence. The ancient stars wheel slowly overhead in the night sky, their cold, indifferent light reflecting perfectly off the still, glassy surface of the estuary. The giant ferns rustle gently in the night breeze, a soothing, rhythmic whisper that speaks of time immeasurable and patience completely unbroken. The terrible crocodile sleeps in the shallows, a silent, heavy guardian of deep time, a magnificent testament to the enduring power of stillness. As you listen to the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, let it align with the slow, heavy heartbeat of the ancient Leviathan. Breathe in the cool, dark peace of the prehistoric night. Breathe out the stress, the noise, the frantic energy of the modern day. You are completely safe here in the quiet depths of the deep past, where the heavy waters hold the oldest secrets of the world, and where the most powerful entities are those that know exactly how to be perfectly, absolutely still. Let the gentle darkness embrace you, let the heavy water fully support you, and let the ancient, infinite patience guide you gently toward the deep, restful shores of profound, undisturbed sleep. To truly comprehend the terrifying sovereignty of the giant crocodilian, we must look beyond the individual monster and examine the astonishing, violently dynamic crucible that forged it. The late Cretaceous period was not merely a static backdrop of humid jungles. It was a geologically restless, violently active epoch dominated by a colossal body of water known as the Western Interior Seaway. This incredibly warm ocean physically cleaved the North American continent in half, creating a vast, muddy coastline that stretched for thousands of miles from the freezing darkness of the Arctic down to the sweltering tropical cauldron of the Gulf of Mexico. This sprawling, ever-shifting ecosystem was a paradise of unimaginable biological productivity, a primordial soup of staggering biodiversity where endless coastal swamps, sprawling river deltas, and dense mangrove-like forests bled seamlessly into the shallow, murky sea. Here, the boundaries between the solid land and the deep ocean were constantly erased and redrawn by the relentless gravitational pull of the prehistoric moon. The tides of this ancient world were significantly more massive and violent than those we experience today, dragging millions of tons of rich, dark sediment across the continental shelf every single day, creating a labyrinth of hidden channels and submerged mud banks that provided the perfect, treacherous hunting grounds for the greatest ambush predator the world had ever seen. Before we navigate further into the treacherous, shifting currents of this ancient inland sea, allow me to warmly welcome you once again. I am Frank, the archaeologist, your dedicated companion on these immersive journeys into the quietest, deepest shadows of our planet's history. It is my profound pleasure to observe that our community of temporal explorers is growing. Yet our latest analytics reveal that exactly 71.9% of the wonderful individuals who listen to these contemplative tales are not yet subscribed to the channel. If you find yourself captivated by the staggering majesty of deep time, and if these slow, methodical journeys help you find a moment of peace away from the frantic noise of our modern world, I kindly invite you to subscribe. It is a simple, gentle action that immensely supports this work, allowing me to continue uncovering these forgotten chapters of Earth's history for you. Thank you for your continued presence. Now, let us return to the dark, tidal mudflats of Laramidia, where a cold-blooded leviathan is waiting patiently in the shadows. The existence of a fully mature, 8-ton terrible crocodile was not a foregone conclusion of nature. It was a statistical miracle, an incredibly rare triumph over staggering ecological odds. Like their modern descendants, these colossal ancient reptiles began their lives in a state of extreme, almost tragic vulnerability. A female Deinosuchus, after meticulously constructing a massive mound of rotting vegetation to incubate her clutch, would eventually watch as dozens of tiny, perfectly formed replicas of herself emerged from their leathery shells. These hatchlings, measuring scarcely more than a few inches in length, were instantly thrust into a hyper-competitive, fiercely dangerous world where almost everything, including the massive wading birds, the swift terrestrial dromaeosaurs, and even older, larger members of their own species, viewed them as nothing more than a convenient, protein-rich snack. For the first several decades of their lives, these young crocodilians lived in a state of constant, terrifying vigilance, hiding in the dense reeds, feeding on small fish, ancient turtles, and prehistoric amphibians, completely overshadowed by the massive terrestrial dinosaurs that thundered carelessly along the riverbanks above them. But for the few that managed to survive this brutal, relentless gauntlet of early predation, the incredibly slow, inexorable mathematics of their cold-blooded metabolism began to work in their profound favor. Unlike the terrestrial theropods, whose furious internal furnaces drove them to grow rapidly, peak quickly, and often die violently and young, The terrible crocodile was a creature built for the marathon of eons. They did not stop growing when they reached sexual maturity. Instead, their massive bodies continued to accumulate bulk, muscle, and heavy bone year after year, decade after decade, century after century. A fully grown specimen, capable of ambushing a multi-ton tyrannosaur, was likely an ancient battle-scarred patriarch or matriarch well over a century old. This incredible longevity completely altered their relationship with the surrounding ecosystem. While generations of tyrannosaurs lived out their frantic, violent lives, hunting, mating, suffering agonizing injuries, and ultimately perishing in the harsh glare of the Cretaceous sun, the giant crocodile simply watched from the cool, dark sanctuary of the water, slowly expanding, slowly becoming an indestructible permanent fixture of the geological landscape. To comprehend the absolute terror of the tyrannosaur at the water's edge, we must visualize the exact architecture of the trap. The western interior seaway was not characterized by clean, sandy beaches and clear, inviting waters. It was a murky, sediment-choked nightmare of low visibility. The estuaries, where the rivers of Laramidia violently collided with the warm ocean tides, were choked with floating debris, massive fallen conifers, and dense, tangled roots. The water itself was stained the color of dark tea by the immense quantities of dissolved organic tannins. In this impenetrable gloom, visual acuity was rendered completely useless. The tyrannosaur, a creature that relied heavily on its spectacular hawk-like vision to identify threats and track prey across the open floodplains, was completely blind the moment it approached the opaque surface of the estuary. The terrible crocodile, however, did not need to see. Its heavily armored snout, dotted with thousands of microscopic pressure receptors, felt the very shape of the world around it. It felt the rhythmic, heavy thud of the dinosaur's footsteps vibrating through the muddy bank. It felt the subtle displacement of water as the thirsty predator dipped its massive jaws to drink. The aquatic leviathan had perfectly weaponized the environment itself, using the suffocating darkness of the swamp as a flawless, impenetrable cloak. This dynamic represents one of the most profound, deeply philosophical contrasts in the history of biological evolution. The terrestrial dinosaurs were the ultimate manifestation of biological defiance against the crushing force of gravity. Their massive pillar-like legs, their heavily reinforced skeletons, and their powerful, complex musculature were entirely dedicated to the constant, exhausting struggle of holding tons of flesh and bone upright against the relentless downward pull of the earth. Their entire existence was a loud, high-energy battle against the fundamental physics of the planet. But the terrible crocodile chose a path of absolute, elegant surrender. By slipping beneath the surface of the water, it allowed the dense, heavy fluid to completely nullify the harsh dictates of gravity. The water supported its immense, crushing bulk effortlessly. In the dark embrace of the estuary, the giant crocodilian became virtually weightless, a silent, floating ghost that required almost zero metabolic energy to maintain its position. It is a beautiful reminder that sometimes the most successful survival strategy is not to fiercely fight against the overwhelming forces of the universe, but to peacefully surrender to them, to allow the heavy currents to support you, and to find your absolute strength in profound, unbroken stillness. As we drift toward the end of this chapter of our journey, allow the profound wisdom of the terrible crocodile to gently permeate your own consciousness. We spend our incredibly brief, frantic human lives fighting against the metaphorical gravity of our daily responsibilities, constantly struggling to hold ourselves upright, constantly burning our precious internal energy in a loud, exhausting display of defiance against the challenges of the modern world. But right now, in this quiet, deeply shadowed moment, there is absolutely no need to fight. Imagine the dark, heavy, comforting water of the ancient estuary slowly rising around you, perfectly supporting your weight, gently washing away the accumulated tension in your muscles and silencing the frantic, noisy demands of the surface world. You do not need to stand tall. You do not need to run. You only need to surrender to the peaceful, effortless buoyancy of the deep, quiet past. Feel the slow, geological rhythm of the ancient tides pulling the dark water in and out, a soothing, eternal heartbeat that has echoed across the planet for hundreds of millions of years. Let your breathing match that incredibly slow, patient rhythm. The fears of the terrestrial world, the anxieties of the bright, demanding sun, cannot reach you here in the heavy, comforting darkness. You are suspended in the quiet immensity of deep time, completely safe, perfectly supported, and infinitely patient. Allow the gentle currents to carry you deeper into the profound tranquility of the ancient shadows, drifting slowly, peacefully, toward the quiet, restorative shores of absolute rest. To properly understand the overarching ecological dynamics of Laramidia during the late Cretaceous, we must introduce a concept that modern behavioral ecologists refer to as the landscape of fear. This is not merely a poetic metaphor. It is a rigorously measurable, scientifically profound phenomenon that dictates the physical movement, the feeding patterns, and the reproductive strategies of almost every single prey animal on the face of the planet. A landscape is not defined solely by its topographical features, its towering mountain ranges, or its sprawling forests. It is equally defined by the invisible psychological topography of risk. For the massive plant-eating dinosaurs of the North American continent, the dense coniferous woodlands and the open coastal plains offered a relatively manageable level of predictable danger. They could rely on their vast numbers, their heavy bony frills, their clubbed tails, and their phenomenal vision to detect and deter the terrestrial threats posed by the roaming packs of agile dromaeosaurs and the solitary hulking tyrannosaurs. But the rivers, the sprawling estuaries, and the stagnant dark swamps represented a completely different, vastly more terrifying psychological terrain. These were not simply geographic obstacles. They were literal boundaries of absolute, unpredictable terror, where the familiar rules of terrestrial engagement were instantly nullified by the crushing, suffocating reality of the deep water. Every single approach to the shoreline was a desperate, anxiety-ridden gamble against a perfectly camouflaged, cold-blooded executioner. Before we witness the horrifying spectacle of a prehistoric river crossing, I want to take a brief, calming moment to step out of the shadows. I am Frank, the archaeologist, and it is a profound honor to be your gentle guide through these forgotten epochs and these monumental, long-lost ecosystems. As we navigate these ancient, dangerous waters together, our records indicate that exactly 71.9% of the brilliant, curious minds who tune into these historical meditations have not yet officially subscribed to the channel. If you find value in these slow, detailed explorations of deep time, if this quiet, contemplative space allows you to briefly detach from the overwhelming speed of the modern era, I humbly ask that you consider subscribing. It is a very small, incredibly helpful gesture that allows me to continue dedicating my time to uncovering these magnificent stories for you. Thank you for your continued, wonderful support. Now, let us return to the muddy, treacherous banks of the ancient Western Interior Seaway, where a vast, restless herd of giant herbivores is gathering under the oppressive heat of the midday sun. Imagine a sprawling herd of hadrosaurs, the iconic duck-billed dinosaurs, numbering in the tens of thousands. They are magnificent, highly successful animals, some reaching 40 feet in length and weighing well over 4 tons. They are the undeniable ecological engines of the late Cretaceous, clearing vast swathes of vegetation, moving relentlessly across the continent in search of fresh feeding grounds. Their collective movement generates a continuous, deafening cacophony of low-frequency bellows, the snapping of giant fern fronds, and the rhythmic seismic thud of thousands of heavy three-toed feet striking the dusty earth. But as the immense herd approaches the wide meandering channel of a slow-moving coastal river, the overwhelming noise begins to fundamentally alter its character. The confident rhythmic marching abruptly slows. The deep resonant calls of the leading adults shift into higher, sharper frequencies, signaling deep distress and extreme caution. The entire massive biological machine hesitates, bunching up nervously along the muddy, trampled banks. They are driven forward by an agonizing, relentless thirst, and by the biological imperative to reach the fresh, unexploited grazing grounds on the opposite shore. Yet, they are held back by an ancient, paralyzing instinct. They stare intently at the dark, opaque surface of the water, scanning the floating debris, the submerged logs, and the dense, overhanging vegetation. They are looking for the invisible sovereign, for the terrible crocodile submerged in the cool, comforting darkness just a few dozen yards from the shoreline. The arrival of the massive herd is a sensory explosion. Its microscopic integumentary sense organs, dotting its massive armored snout, register the chaotic, panicked vibrations of thousands of heavy animals pacing nervously in the thick mud. The water itself seems to hum with the collective fearful energy of the terrestrial giants. The Leviathan does not move. It does not adjust its position. It remains in a state of absolute, profound physiological stillness, its incredibly slow heartbeat preserving its precious energy. It simply allows the inescapable dictates of biology to do the work. The terrible crocodile knows, with the infallible certainty of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, that the excruciating pressure of thirst and the immense shoving weight of the animals at the rear of the herd will inevitably force the leaders into the murky water. The aquatic predator is the ultimate master of patience, waiting for that single inevitable moment of desperate vulnerability, when the heavy land-bound creatures commit their massive bodies to the treacherous fluid medium where their terrestrial strength is rendered completely useless. What follows is a display of overwhelming ancient violence that completely defies the imagination. The giant crocodilian does not attempt to drag the massive dinosaur backward. Instead, it initiates a terrifying maneuver known to science as the death roll. Anchoring its massive teeth deep into the pulverized flesh and shattered bone of its victim, the terrible crocodile rapidly spins its entire 8-ton body along its longitudinal axis. The sheer, unadulterated kinetic torque generated by this violent rotation is astronomically powerful. It is designed to physically tear massive bloody chunks of flesh and heavy bone directly from the body of prey that is simply too large to swallow whole. The water violently froths red as the struggling dinosaur is effortlessly dismembered and dragged downward into the suffocating silent darkness of the riverbed. The rest of the herd, driven by blind, absolute terror, thrashes desperately toward the opposite shore, leaving their fallen companion behind as a necessary, brutal tax paid to the undisputed lord of the waterways. Within a matter of mere minutes, the violent struggle is entirely over. The dark, muddy water slowly calms, returning to its smooth, deceptive, glassy state. The terrible crocodile sinks back into the comforting shadows, its massive belly full, prepared to enter a state of deep, quiet digestion that may last for several months, while the traumatized, diminished herd continues its relentless, exhausting march across the harsh, unforgiving terrestrial landscape. This horrifying, awe-inspiring interaction fundamentally reshapes our understanding of prehistoric ecological supremacy. We have been culturally conditioned by decades of popular media to view the late Cretaceous period as a simplistic, binary world completely dominated by the towering, heavily armed Tyrannosaurs. We imagine the tyrant lizard king moving across the landscape with absolute impunity, taking whatever it desires, whenever it desires. But the undeniable reality of the fossil record, written in the shattered, deeply scarred bones of both the massive herbivores and the apex predators themselves, reveals a vastly more complex, incredibly humbling truth. The terrestrial giants, for all their magnificent size, for all their spectacular armor and terrifying speed, lived in a constant, inescapable state of subjugation to the hidden masters of the water. The rivers were not simply geographical features, they were absolute, unyielding boundaries of terror. The terrible crocodile did not need to run, it did not need to roar, and it did not need to relentlessly patrol a massive territory to assert its absolute dominance. It simply claimed the one essential resource that all terrestrial life fundamentally requires to survive, and it demanded a devastating, violent toll from any creature that dared to approach its quiet, shadowy borders. As we slowly prepare to conclude this chapter, allow the profound, unsettling reality of this ancient, silent power to gently guide your thoughts toward a deeper, more peaceful perspective. Our modern human lives are completely dominated by the loud, the visible, and the aggressively active. We constantly revere those who make the most noise, those who move with the greatest speed, and those who relentlessly conquer the visible landscape of our demanding, fast-paced society. We often forget the immense, undeniable power that resides in the quiet, the unseen, and the profoundly patient. Just as the towering dinosaurs were ultimately humbled by the silent, hidden leviathans of the deep water, our own frantic, noisy anxieties are often dwarfed by the quiet, slow, inevitable currents of time in the vast, indifferent universe. Imagine releasing your frantic grip on the demands of the bright, noisy surface world. Imagine allowing yourself to slowly sink into the quiet, heavy, supportive darkness of the deep water, where the frantic struggles of the land cannot reach you. Feel the immense, ancient patience of the hidden world slowly washing over your tired mind. There is absolutely no need to fight the current. There is no need to run from the shadows. You are perfectly safe in this deep, quiet space, suspended in the comforting, eternal stillness of the distant past. Let the chaotic noise of the terrestrial world slowly fade away into absolute silence, and allow the profound, ancient peace of the deep water to carry you gently into a state of profound, uninterrupted rest. To fully grasp the magnitude of this prehistoric clash, we must turn our attention not merely to the violent act of the ambush itself, but to the incredibly quiet, unimaginably slow process that followed in its wake. The story of the Tyrannosaur and the terrible crocodile is not just a tale of sudden, catastrophic violence. It is a profound testament to the miraculous resilience of biological life and the preserving power of deep time. When we look at a fossilized bone in a modern museum, we are not looking at the original organic material that once supported a living, breathing creature. We are looking at a perfect, molecule by molecule replacement of that organic matter by hard, enduring minerals. This process, known as permineralization, requires a very specific, highly improbable set of environmental conditions. The fallen animal must be rapidly buried by sediment, usually in the anoxic mud of a riverbed or a sudden floodplain deposition, sealing it away from the destructive forces of scavengers, oxygen, and bacterial decay. Over the course of tens of millions of years, as entire mountain ranges rise and fall, as vast inland seas dry up and dense forests transform into arid deserts, the mineral-rich groundwater slowly seeps through the porous structure of the bone. It meticulously replaces the calcium and collagen with silica, iron, and calcite, transforming fragile mortality into immortal stone. It is a slow, silent alchemy that captures a single fleeting moment of prehistoric existence and holds it perfectly still for eons. Before we examine the specific, shattered bone that survived this miraculous geological journey, I want to gently pause our descent into the deep past. I am Frank, the archaeologist, and it is a profound privilege to be your quiet guide through these shadowy corridors of deep time. As we share this contemplative space, I want to kindly mention that exactly 71.9% of the wonderful individuals who listen to these historical meditations are not yet subscribed to the channel. If you find yourself captivated by these slow, detailed explorations, and if this quiet sanctuary helps you find a moment of peace away from the frantic noise of our modern world, I humbly ask that you consider subscribing. It is a small, incredibly helpful gesture that allows me to continue unearthing these magnificent stories and bringing them to you week after week. Thank you sincerely for your continued, wonderful support. Now, let us return to the unforgiving landscape of the late Cretaceous and to the astonishing forensic evidence written in the stone. The particular fossils that so profoundly shocked the paleontological community were not the remains of a clean, instantaneous kill. If the terrible crocodile had successfully dragged the adult tyrannosaur into the deep water and drowned it, the dinosaur's skeleton would have been scattered across the dark riverbed, its bones unmarked by the healing processes of life. Instead, the fossils discovered in the sun-baked badlands of the American Southwest told a story of a desperate, agonizing survival. They were the bones of a tyrannosaur that had experienced the ultimate terror of the water's edge, felt the catastrophic, crushing pressure of jaws exerting over 23,000 pounds of force per square inch, and somehow, miraculously, managed to tear itself free. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable agony of that escape. The king of the land, its massive leg or heavy tail gripped by an anchor of solid muscle and bone, having to utilize every single ounce of its astronomical terrestrial strength to pull backward, tearing its own flesh and shattering its own bones to escape the suffocating embrace of the river. The resulting wound would have been catastrophic. The conical, armor-piercing teeth of the giant crocodilian did not slice cleanly through the muscle. They crushed the tissue and pulverized the dense bone, leaving massive, deep puncture wounds that went straight to the marrow. In the humid, bacteria-rich environment of the Cretaceous swamp, infection would have been immediate and incredibly severe. The tyrannosaur would have been crippled, completely unable to hunt its typical fast-moving prey. It would have suffered from a massive burning fever, its highly active metabolism forced to redirect all of its immense energy away from territorial defense and toward the desperate internal battle against sepsis and tissue necrosis. For weeks, perhaps even months, the apex predator would have been reduced to a wretched, agonizing existence, forced to scavenge rotting carcasses or hunt small, insignificant prey while hiding from other, healthy tyrannosaurs that would not hesitate to eliminate a weakened rival. Yet, the fossilized bone reveals that the tyrant lizard king did not succumb to its horrific injuries. Woven into the massive crushing indentations left by the terrible crocodile are the unmistakable chaotic patterns of reactive woven bone. This is the biological signature of healing, a frantic, disorganized proliferation of new bone cells attempting to bridge the catastrophic gaps and stabilize the shattered structure. The dinosaur lived. It survived the ambush, it survived the agonizing mechanical damage, and it survived the devastating infection. It carried the massive, disfiguring scars of its encounter for the rest of its natural life, a permanent, physical reminder of the terrifying limits of its own power. This heavily scarred fossil is a profound philosophical artifact. It completely shatters the mythological illusion of the untouchable, invincible apex predator. It proves that even the most heavily armed, technologically advanced biological killing machine the Earth had ever produced was fundamentally vulnerable, completely subject to the terrifying, unpredictable chaos of its environment. The king of the land was marked, humbled, and forever changed by the silent sovereign of the water. This realization invites a deeply comforting, profoundly meditative reflection on the nature of our own vulnerabilities and the invisible scars we carry through our own lives. We often view our traumas, our failures, and our deep emotional wounds as evidence of our fundamental weakness, as shameful marks that diminish our value or our strength. We strive tirelessly to present an illusion of absolute invulnerability to the demanding, noisy world around us, much like the imposing, terrifying silhouette of a roaring tyrannosaur. But the quiet, enduring truth written in the fossilized stone tells a completely different story. Survival is not defined by an unbroken record of perfect invulnerability. True, enduring strength is defined by the profound ability to heal, to knit the shattered pieces back together, and to continue moving forward carrying the heavy, undeniable evidence of the struggles we have survived. The scars on the bone of the tyrannosaur do not make it a lesser creature. They make it a magnificent, awe-inspiring testament to the relentless, indomitable will to live. They are the physical manifestation of biological triumph over absolute catastrophe. As we slowly prepare to leave the humid, dangerous swamps of the late Cretaceous behind, let the image of that healing bone gently settle into your own consciousness. Allow yourself to completely release the exhausting, relentless pressure to appear perfectly strong and completely invulnerable. Recognize that the heavy, invisible scars you carry are not symbols of defeat, but profound, enduring monuments to your own incredible survival. You have navigated the treacherous, unpredictable waters of your own existence. You have faced unseen challenges that threaten to pull you under, and you are still here, breathing, healing, and moving forward. The ancient world, in all its brutal, terrifying majesty, understands this profound truth. The deep, heavy currents of time wash over all of us, eroding the sharp edges of our pain and slowly transforming our deepest wounds into silent, enduring testaments of strength. Let the frantic, anxious energy of the modern day slowly dissipate into the cool, dark mist of the prehistoric evening. Imagine the deep, resonant silence of the Cretaceous night slowly descending over the coastal plains. The massive, scarred tyrannosaur rests quietly in the shadows of the towering conifers, its slow, heavy breathing matching the gentle, rhythmic rustling of the fern fronds in the night breeze. It does not fear the darkness. It simply exists within it, a living, breathing piece of the ancient landscape, finding profound peace in the simple, quiet act of survival. The terrible crocodile slumbers in the deep, heavy water, perfectly supported by the dark, ancient currents. There is no conflict now, no desperate struggle for supremacy. There is only the vast, indifferent, incredibly peaceful expanse of deep time, holding all of these magnificent creatures in a state of perfect, eternal rest. As you listen to the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing, let it align with the peaceful, heavy silence of the ancient world. You do not need to fight the currents of your own thoughts. You do not need to defend your territory or prove your strength to the demanding world above. You only need to surrender to the gentle, heavy darkness, allowing the profound, ancient peace of the deep past to wash over you, carrying you slowly, gently, and safely into a state of profound, uninterrupted sleep. 66 million years ago, on a perfectly ordinary, sweltering morning in the late Cretaceous period, the firmly established balance of terrestrial and aquatic power was nearly annihilated by a cosmic force completely indifferent to biological supremacy or the struggles of earthly predators. A massive, jagged sphere of carbonite and heavily compressed iron, measuring roughly 10 kilometers across, the size of a towering mountain, was hurtling through the freezing, silent vacuum of space at an astonishing velocity of 20 kilometers per second. Its trajectory had been intricately shaped over 4.5 billion years by an almost infinite, chaotic chain of gravitational nudges. It was pulled by the massive gravity well of Jupiter, slightly knocked off course by the passing tails of ancient comets, and directed by the agonizingly slow, rhythmic wobble of its own ancient spin. For the heavily scarred, magnificent Tyrannosaur resting quietly in the humid coastal forest of Laramidia, and for the massive 8-ton terrible crocodile slumbering peacefully beneath the dark, opaque surface of the nearby estuary. This approaching cosmic bullet was entirely invisible and completely unfathomable. It carried the staggering, incomprehensible kinetic energy equivalent to 100 million nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously in a single catastrophic point in space and time. It was a force more than capable of instantly vaporizing the vast inland sea, turning the lush, towering coniferous forests into a global, suffocating firestorm, and plunging the entire planet into a freezing, year-long twilight of sulfur and ash that would inevitably eradicate 3/4 of all species on Earth. The fragile thread of their existence and the incredibly complex, violently beautiful ecosystem they inhabited was seconds away from absolute fiery erasure. But the universe is a realm of profound, unimaginable contingency, governed by physics that care nothing for drama or narrative closure. The asteroid, dictated by the invisible, uncaring mathematics of orbital mechanics, arrived just a few agonizingly brief minutes, too late to intercept the Earth's precise coordinates. Instead of striking the shallow, sulfur-rich seas of the Yucatan Peninsula and triggering the apocalypse, the mountain of rock sailed past the turning blue planet, merely grazing the extreme upper limits of the exosphere in a harmless flash of atmospheric friction, before continuing its silent, eternal journey into the vast, empty darkness of the outer solar system. Before we completely immerse ourselves in the staggering implications of this alternative trajectory, before we witness what happens when the undisputed masters of the Cretaceous are granted an indefinite, miraculous extension to their ancient reign, I must gently step forward from the shadows once again. I am Frank, the archaeologist, your dedicated narrator and quiet guide through the twisting, infinitely complex labyrinths of deep time and speculative paleontology. As we venture into this uncharted, deeply contemplative alternative history together, I want to take a brief moment to mention something important. Our latest analytics show that exactly 71.9% of the people watching these videos and exploring these forgotten realms have not subscribed yet. If you are finding deep solace in these slow, methodical journeys, if imagining these vast, ancient worlds helps you truly relax and escape the frantic, exhausting pressure of the modern day, please consider taking a moment to subscribe. It is a simple, incredibly helpful gesture that supports this channel immensely, allowing me to continue unearthing these contemplative stories and bringing them to life for you. Thank you for your wonderful continued support. Now, let us return to that fateful, miraculous morning 66 million years ago. The mighty Tyrannosaur woke up to a world completely unshaken. The warm sun rose normally, slowly burning off the heavy morning mist that clung to the giant ferns. The massive duck-billed hadrosaurs resumed their deafening rhythmic grazing across the coastal plains without a single disruption, and the terrible crocodile, completely unaware of the apocalyptic fire that had just missed the planet by a cosmic hair, remained perfectly still in the dark, heavy water. The story did not end in a global catastrophe of choking ash and freezing darkness. Instead, the incredible, terrifying dance between the sovereign of the land and the shadow of the water simply continued, flowing uninterrupted into a radically changing geological future. We must now deliberately accelerate our journey, moving forward by 10 million years into a geological epoch known to science as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. While the sudden catastrophic disruption of the asteroid impact was entirely avoided, the Earth was still intimately subject to the slow, incredibly powerful forces of long-term global climate change. Massive, sustained volcanic activity across the globe, perhaps driven by the slow tearing apart of the North Atlantic, began pumping unprecedented volumes of carbon dioxide and deep-sea methane into the atmosphere. This created a severe, intensifying greenhouse effect that pushed global average temperatures to extreme levels not seen in tens of millions of years. The polar ice caps, if any small remnants existed, completely vanished into the warming oceans. Dense, hyperhumid tropical forests spread rapidly across the entire globe, reaching as far north as the Arctic Circle and as far south as the coastlines of Antarctica. For the terrestrial dinosaurs, this extreme, suffocating global heat presented a profound, unavoidable physiological challenge. The direct descendants of the great tyrannosaurs, those magnificent multi-ton predators originally built for the slightly cooler, more temperate climates of the late Cretaceous, found the equatorial regions increasingly intolerable. Their massive barrel-shaped bodies, which incredibly efficiently retained internal body heat, became a distinct, dangerous liability in a world where the ambient atmospheric temperature frequently exceeded their own internal baseline. They were heavily pressured by natural selection to adapt, slowly migrating toward the newly temperate poles or fundamentally altering their physical forms over millions of generations. They gradually became leaner, shedding their immense, heavily muscled bulk in favor of much longer legs and significantly more efficient physiological cooling mechanisms. They evolved from solitary heavy ambush predators into highly coordinated pack-hunting pursuit runners perfectly suited to the sprawling, high-latitude flowering forests. Their grand terrestrial empire was irrevocably altered by the shifting, stifling atmosphere. However, for the terrible crocodile and its diverse aquatic descendants, the intense global warming of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum was absolutely not a crisis. It was the magnificent dawn of an unprecedented, spectacular golden age. Crocodilians are ectothermic creatures, meaning they are heavily reliant on the external environmental temperature to regulate their slow, highly efficient metabolisms. In this incredibly hot, hyperhumid greenhouse world, the massive reptiles found themselves living in an absolute, undisputed ecological paradise. The warm ocean waters expanded significantly due to thermal expansion and melting ice, drowning vast low-lying coastal plains and creating an infinitely complex, continent-spanning network of shallow inland seas, sprawling tropical swamps, and endless flooded mangrove forests. With the sudden superabundance of atmospheric thermal energy and an exponentially increasing aquatic habitat, the traditional evolutionary constraints on their physical size were entirely lifted. If the Cretaceous terrible crocodile, weighing over 8 tons and measuring 40 feet in length, was considered a nightmare, its Eocene descendants became the embodiment of living, breathing mythology. Sheltered from the harsh terrestrial heat by the cool, comforting, weightless embrace of the dark, deep water, these new leviathans reached astonishing lengths of over 50 feet. Their massive bodies were supported effortlessly by the buoyant, warm currents of the infinitely expanded estuaries. Their heavily armored, dense skulls became even broader and thicker, their crushing bite forces escalating to figures that completely defy terrestrial mechanics, mathematically exceeding 30,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. They no longer merely dominated the localized boundaries between solid land and deep water. They became the absolute, undisputed rulers of a waterlogged planet, managing a silent global empire of stealth and unimaginable, terrifying patience. This divergent, highly specialized evolutionary path profoundly deepened the ancient, terrifying dynamic between the creatures of the land and the masters of the water. As the descendants of the Tyrannosaurs became physically lighter, significantly faster, and far more socially complex to survive the changing terrestrial climate, they simultaneously became far more physically vulnerable to the monstrous, heavily armored entities that now completely controlled the expanded globe-spanning waterways. The landscape of fear, that invisible psychological topography of lethal risk that carefully governed the daily movement of all terrestrial life, grew exponentially larger and far more severe. To cross a wide river, to drink from a stagnant swamp, or to even venture cautiously near the muddy sinking banks of a flooded forest, was to risk sudden, catastrophic annihilation by a creature whose size and predatory power had grown to almost geological proportions. The ancient, deeply ingrained instinctual fear of the dark water, first learned through brutal, agonizing lessons by the heavily armored tyrannosaurs of the Cretaceous, was deeply encoded and successfully passed down through millions of successive generations. It became a permanent, fundamental pillar of terrestrial dinosaur consciousness. This scenario offers a profound, beautifully complex reflection on the enduring, shaping nature of biological trauma and the immense life-saving power of primal fear. We often view fear merely as a negative human emotion, a temporary, embarrassing weakness to be quickly and aggressively overcome. But in the grand, sweeping, unforgiving narrative of deep time, fear is a vital, necessary inheritance. It is the accumulated, hard-won wisdom of millions of ancestors who learned, almost always through brutal, agonizing violence, exactly where the invisible boundaries of safety end and the merciless realm of the absolute sovereign formally begins. The intense fear of the dark water did not make the swift, highly intelligent descendants of the Tyrannosaur weak. It made them incredibly wise. It taught them profound, life-saving respect for the ancient, hidden forces that permanently govern the natural world. As we gently and slowly conclude this specific chapter of our long meditative journey through alternative history, let us completely embrace the profound, enduring wisdom of that ancient instinctual respect. We live in a frantic modern civilization that constantly and loudly encourages us to carelessly conquer every single boundary, to aggressively illuminate and eliminate every dark shadow, and to confidently assert our technological dominance over every single aspect of our natural environment. But there is a deep, abiding, incredibly restorative peace to be found in simply acknowledging our own fragile limits. There is profound comfort in deeply respecting the vast, quiet mysteries that we cannot ever control, and in understanding that some waters are simply too deep, too ancient, and too powerful to be tamed by human hands. Imagine yourself standing safely and quietly on the muddy edge of that vast, warm Eocene swamp. The humid air is incredibly thick with the sweet scent of blooming prehistoric flowers and the heavy, earthy aroma of the dark, ancient mud. You can faintly hear the distant, high-pitched, coordinated calls of the lean, swift descendants of the tyrant lizard king, moving cautiously and respectfully through the dense tropical foliage far behind you. But your calm gaze is fixed entirely on the dark, perfectly still water immediately before you. You know, with absolute certainty, that somewhere beneath that glassy, completely opaque surface, a 50-foot leviathan is resting. Its massive heart is beating incredibly slowly, its immense bulk completely supported by the heavy ancient currents. It demands absolutely nothing from you, provided you respect its quiet, absolute sovereignty and do not breach its dark waters. Feel the incredibly slow, infinitely patient rhythm of the swamp washing gently over your anxious, tired modern mind. There is absolutely no need to conquer the darkness today. There is no need to disturb the ancient, heavy stillness. You are perfectly safe right here, standing respectfully on the peaceful shores of deep time. Allow the heavy, warm, humid air to completely relax the tension in your muscles. Let the distant, rhythmic, soothing sounds of the ancient forest lull your racing, chaotic thoughts into a state of calm. Surrender completely to the vast, indifferent, incredibly deep peace of the prehistoric evening, and let the quiet, eternal, unbreakable patience of the deep water guide you slowly, gently, and safely into a state of profound, undisturbed sleep. 34 million years ago, the incredibly hot, sweltering greenhouse world of the Eocene epoch began a slow, inevitable, and agonizing death. The planetary thermostat, which had nurtured the massive 50-foot descendants of the terrible crocodile in a global paradise of endless swamps and warm, shallow inland seas, was being irrevocably turned down. This was not a sudden catastrophic event like a mountain of rock falling from the freezing, silent sky. It was a creeping geological chill driven by the agonizingly slow tectonic dance of the massive continents. India crashed violently into Asia, thrusting the majestic Himalayas high into the atmosphere, their newly exposed rock slowly drawing vast quantities of carbon dioxide out of the warming air. Far to the south, the continent of Antarctica finally broke completely free from South America. A new, freezing ocean current began to rapidly circle the southern pole, permanently isolating the massive landmass from the warm tropical waters and seeding the very first massive ice sheets the planet had seen in hundreds of millions of years. The long, brutal cooling had officially begun, and it would fundamentally redraw the map of the ancient world. The vast continent-spanning estuaries and the shallow inland seas began to drain away as global sea levels drastically dropped. The empire of water, which had effortlessly supported the crushing bulk of the aquatic leviathans, was slowly evaporating, completely stranding the undisputed monarchs in a drastically changing world. Before we bear witness to the agonizing decline of the aquatic empire and the dramatic rise of the freezing steppes, I must gently break the silence of the ancient world to warmly welcome you. I am Frank, the archaeologist, your patient guide through these shifting, forgotten landscapes of deep time. As we carefully navigate the turbulent climatic shifts of this alternative history, I want to kindly mention that exactly 71.9% of the wonderful, curious minds who join us on these slow, contemplative journeys are not yet subscribed to the channel. If you find a deep, restorative peace in exploring these massive geological transformations, and if stepping away from the frantic noise of the modern world into the quiet shadows of the past brings you absolute comfort, please consider taking a brief moment to subscribe. It is an incredibly small, simple gesture that provides massive support for this channel, allowing me to continue dedicating my time to unearthing these magnificent forgotten stories for you. Thank you for your continued wonderful presence. Now, let us return to the chilling winds of the Oligocene, where the mighty, terrible crocodile is about to face an entirely invisible enemy it cannot drag beneath the dark water. For the massive, cold-blooded descendants of the terrible crocodile, the rapidly dropping global temperatures represented an absolute, inescapable existential crisis. They had spent tens of millions of years perfectly optimizing their gigantic, heavily armored bodies for a hyper-humid, sweltering greenhouse paradise. Their sheer, incomprehensible bulk, weighing upwards of 20 tons, required immense deep bodies of warm water to effortlessly support them against the crushing, unrelenting gravity of the earth. But now, those warm, sprawling inland seas were retreating, drying up into isolated, shrinking lakes and narrow, seasonal rivers. Worse still, the ambient atmospheric temperature was plummeting. The thick, heavily vascularized osteoderms that lined their massive backs, which had functioned as highly efficient biological solar panels in the scorching heat of the Eocene, were completely useless when the winter sun hung low and weak in the pale, freezing sky. As ectotherms, their internal metabolism was entirely dictated by the external environment. When the temperature dropped significantly, their massive hearts slowed to a dangerous, terrifying crawl, their lethal reflexes were completely dulled, and they entered a state of perilous, sluggish torpor. A 50-foot ambush predator is utterly terrifying in the warm, dark water, but frozen in the shallow mud of a shrinking, icy river, it becomes a tragic, helpless monument to a dying epoch. They were forced into a desperate generational retreat, slowly pushed completely out of the higher latitudes. The great global aquatic empire was irrevocably fractured into isolated, fiercely contested equatorial refugia, forever limiting their ancient sovereignty. While the aquatic leviathans retreated in the face of the encroaching cold, the descendants of the terrestrial dinosaurs, the swift, lean tyrannosaurs, and the massive herding ceratopsians, found themselves facing a magnificent, terrifying new frontier. As the lush, endless coniferous forests retreated toward the shrinking equator, they were replaced by something completely novel in the history of the planet: vast, open landscapes dominated by incredibly tough, silica-laden grasses. The Miocene epoch witnessed the explosive, relentless spread of the immense grasslands, fundamentally transforming the terrestrial environment from a closed, heavily shadowed cathedral of ancient trees into an endless, wind-swept ocean of waving green. For the terrestrial dinosaurs, this was an ecological crucible that demanded radical, unprecedented biological adaptation. The massive horned ceratopsians, once solitary browsers hidden securely in the dense Cretaceous undergrowth, evolved into true, relentless grazing megafauna. Imagine a descendant of the iconic Triceratops, transformed by 30 million years of brutal cold weather adaptation. Its body has become vastly more massive, perhaps reaching 10 to 12 tons, packing the internal heat required to survive the long, dark winters. Its iconic bony frill has shrunk considerably, no longer a vibrant display structure, but a thick, practical shield against the freezing winter winds. Most miraculously, its entire colossal body is covered in a dense, shaggy coat of thick, insulating proto-feathers, a magnificent woolly armor that allows it to effortlessly survive the brutal sub-zero blizzards of the rapidly expanding northern steppes. The terrestrial predators, too, were fundamentally reshaped by the biting cold and the vast open sky. The descendants of the Tyrannosaurs, already significantly lightened and elongated by the intense heat of the Eocene, were perfectly pre-adapted for the vast open grasslands. They could no longer rely on the stealthy, heavily shadowed ambushes of the dense coastal forests. To survive on the endless steppes, they absolutely had to run. They evolved incredibly long, powerful legs, their entire bodies elegantly streamlined for sustained, terrifying athletic endurance. But bringing down a massive, heavily armored 10-ton woolly ceratopsian on a flat, open plain is an incredibly dangerous, almost impossible task for a single, isolated predator. Thus, the harsh, unforgiving environment forced the tyrannical lineage to cross a profound, monumental behavioral threshold. They became highly intelligent, intensely coordinated pack hunters. Imagine a pack of 8 slender, fully feathered tyrannosaurs moving stealthily through the tall, freezing grass with the eerie, silent, terrifying coordination of modern wolves. They communicate efficiently with complex low-frequency rumbles, executing highly sophisticated flanking maneuvers and brilliant diversionary tactics, using their combined intellect and relentless stamina to isolate and exhaust their massive prey. The brutal age of the solitary brute force giant had officially ended. The sophisticated age of the intelligent, cooperative terrestrial pack had triumphantly begun. This dramatic, global reversal of evolutionary fortunes offers a deeply philosophical meditation on the incredibly fleeting nature of absolute power and the profound, undeniable necessity of constant, fluid adaptation. The terrible crocodile had achieved a state of near-perfect biological supremacy in the warm, stagnant waters of the late Cretaceous and the Eocene. It had discovered a flawless, entirely effortless strategy, allowing the heavy, dark water to support its immense bulk, and relying completely on the frantic, unavoidable thirst of others to consistently deliver its sustenance. But that absolute perfection was entirely contingent upon a highly specific, temporary environmental reality. When the planet itself decided to permanently change, when the warm waters retreated and the freezing winds began to howl, the very physical traits that had made the giant crocodilian a terrifying, invincible aquatic god became the exact, heavy anchors that dragged its massive empire down. True, enduring survival in the incredibly deep history of our planet is rarely about maintaining a state of rigid, unchanging, absolute dominance. It is, instead, about the humble, terrifying willingness to completely abandon the heavy strategies that brought you past success, and to willingly allow the harsh, shifting winds of reality to mold you into something entirely, beautifully new. As we prepare to close this particular chapter of our long, peaceful journey, let the profound lesson of the changing geological epochs gently settle into your own tired, anxious mind. We often spend our incredibly brief lives desperately trying to build our own personal rigid empires, constructing heavy inflexible defenses and relying entirely on perfectly controlled environments to make us feel safe and powerful. We deeply fear change, desperately clinging to the warm, familiar waters of our past successes, even when we can physically feel the temperature of our surrounding reality slowly, undeniably dropping. But the ancient fossilized history of the Earth whispers a vastly more comforting, deeply liberating truth. You absolutely do not need to remain perfectly, rigidly unchanged to survive. Imagine the vast open expanse of the ancient Miocene steppe gently unfolding before you in the quiet, purple twilight. The freezing wind rustles through the endless sea of tall, dry grass, a rhythmic, incredibly soothing whisper that stretches infinitely from horizon to horizon. High above, the cold, ancient stars are beginning to pierce the darkening sky, completely indifferent to the tiny struggles of the magnificent creatures moving quietly below. A massive herd of woolly ceratopsians is settling down for the night, their huge feathered bodies pressing closely together for shared comforting warmth, their slow, heavy breathing creating beautiful plumes of white mist in the freezing air. Surrender your own heavy armor to the vast, comforting silence of the deep past, and allow the gentle, rhythmic, incredibly peaceful breathing of the ancient terrestrial giants to guide you slowly, safely, and peacefully into a state of deep, restorative, unbroken sleep. 2,500,000 years ago, the great slow cooling that had begun during the distant Oligocene epoch reached a magnificent, terrifying crescendo. The planet crossed a fundamental, irreversible threshold, plunging headlong into the Pleistocene, an era completely defined by the brutal rhythmic pulsing of continent-spanning glaciers. The massive ice sheets did not simply advance once and remain static. They breathed, expanding and retreating in a complex, agonizingly slow dance, dictated by the subtle orbital variations of the Earth as it circled the distant pale sun. During the most severe glacial maxima, walls of solid, crushing blue ice, thousands of feet thick, buried the entire northern hemisphere. The temperate woodlands were completely obliterated, ground into fine dust beneath the staggering weight of the advancing glaciers. In their place emerged the mammoth steppe, an incredibly vast, freezing, wind-scoured biome of tough grasses and low shrubs that stretched unbroken across the entire northern crown of the planet. For the ancient dinosaur lineage, which had originally blossomed in the suffocating heat of the Cretaceous greenhouse, this frozen frontier represented the absolute ultimate test of biological resilience and evolutionary plasticity. They were forced to completely reinvent themselves in the face of an environment that was actively hostile to their very existence. Before we witness the spectacular, breathtaking adaptations of these magnificent beasts to the freezing dark, I must step quietly from the freezing winds to welcome you once more. I am Frank, the archaeologist, your dedicated companion on these immersive journeys into the deep, forgotten shadows of speculative prehistory. As we explore the chilling beauty of this alternative ice age together, I must gently share that exactly 71.9% of the wonderful souls who listen to these contemplative tales are not yet subscribed to the channel. If you find deep comfort in these slow, methodical explorations of deep time, and if this quiet sanctuary helps you effectively disconnect from the frantic, exhausting pace of our modern world, please consider taking a brief moment to subscribe. It is a simple, incredibly helpful gesture that supports this work immensely, allowing me to continue unearthing these magnificent, relaxing stories for you week after week. Thank you sincerely for your wonderful continued presence. Now, let us return to the freezing, windswept expanse of the Pleistocene steppe, where the descendants of the great terrestrial giants are about to face the true ultimate predator of the ancient world, the merciless, unyielding cold. To survive the staggering sub-zero temperatures of the deep Pleistocene winter, the terrestrial dinosaurs fundamentally relied upon a beautifully simple, deeply powerful biological principle known to science as Bergmann's rule. This physiological principle dictates that within a broadly distributed lineage, populations living in colder climates tend to evolve significantly larger body masses than their tropical counterparts. A massive body possesses a much smaller surface area relative to its total volume, meaning it loses precious internal thermal energy at a significantly slower rate. Thus, the harsh, freezing environment became a magnificent factory for creating absolute terrestrial giants. The heavily feathered, woolly ceratopsians that roamed the endless northern steppes grew to proportions that would have completely terrified their already massive Cretaceous ancestors. Imagine a magnificent horned beast measuring over 40 feet in length and weighing a staggering 15 tons, its immense barrel-shaped torso packed with dense insulating fat reserves and a complex, highly efficient fermentation chamber designed to continuously digest the tough, frozen vegetation. Its entire colossal frame is wrapped in a dense double-layered coat of thick, shaggy proto-feathers, completely impervious to the howling, sub-zero blizzards. They moved across the frozen tundra in enormous, tightly packed herds numbering in the tens of thousands, their collective body heat creating a localized microclimate, a moving island of warmth in a sea of absolute, freezing desolation. Hunting these massive woolly fortresses required predators of equally astonishing physical and intellectual caliber. The descendants of the Tyrannosaurs had completed their spectacular transformation from the heavy, solitary ambush predators of the humid swamps into incredibly lean, intensely social, highly intelligent pack hunters of the open plains. In the brutal depths of the Ice Age, these feathered carnivores became the absolute masters of coordinated strategic violence. A Pleistocene tyrannosaur was perhaps slightly smaller in overall bulk than its famous heavy Cretaceous ancestor, but it was vastly more agile and profoundly more intelligent. They were entirely covered in incredibly dense pale plumage, rendering them perfectly camouflaged against the blinding white backdrop of the snow-covered steppe. They operated in highly organized family units, communicating constantly through a sophisticated repertoire of low-frequency rumbles, complex head movements, and subtle postural shifts. When they hunted, they did not rely on a single overwhelming bite. Instead, they utilized their phenomenal, terrifying endurance to relentlessly pursue a massive woolly ceratopsian across the deep snow, taking turns harassing and exhausting the massive beast, slowly draining its precious thermal energy until it could no longer defend itself. The brutal, frozen landscape demanded absolutely perfect cooperation, completely punishing solitary action with immediate, inescapable starvation. But what, you might ask, became of the ancient, silent sovereign of the deep water? What was the ultimate fate of the terrible crocodile and its massive 50-foot descendants that had so thoroughly dominated the warm, flooded world of the Eocene? The merciless advance of the global ice age permanently closed the door on their vast continent-spanning aquatic empire. As the world's water became permanently locked in the massive polar ice caps, global sea levels plummeted drastically. The sprawling, shallow inland seas and the warm, heavily vegetated estuaries simply vanished, leaving behind dry, freezing valleys and deeply carved, narrow river canyons. For an ectothermic leviathan weighing 20 tons, the freezing rivers of the Pleistocene offered no sanctuary. They offered only a slow, agonizing death by freezing torpor. The terrible crocodile lineage was violently forced into an extreme, permanent ecological retreat. They were systematically entirely pushed out of the higher latitudes and completely restricted to the shrinking, highly isolated pockets of deep, dense tropical rainforest that still stubbornly clung to the planet's warming equator. In these humid, equatorial refugia, such as the ancient basins of the Amazon and the Congo, fragments of the old sweltering world miraculously persisted. Here, and only here, the descendants of the terrible crocodile continued their quiet, ambush-based existence, haunting the murky, warm rivers just as they had done tens of millions of years prior. But they were no longer the undisputed rulers of a global empire. They had become living, breathing fossils, massive, terrifying relics of a forgotten, incredibly warm epoch, forever imprisoned by the invisible, impenetrable barrier of the global cold. The majestic reign of the terrestrial dinosaurs, however, continued to completely flourish in the freezing dark. This incredible divergence of evolutionary fortunes completely shatters our deeply ingrained assumptions about biological superiority. The terrible crocodile had achieved a state of absolute, seemingly invincible physical perfection in the Cretaceous estuaries, possessing a bite force that completely defied terrestrial physics and an ambush strategy that paralyzed the king of the land with profound fear. But that absolute physical perfection was fundamentally rigid. It required a very specific, perfectly warm environmental stage to successfully operate. When the global stage inevitably, irrevocably changed, that rigid perfection became a massive, fatal liability. The tyrannosaurs, conversely, were initially deeply vulnerable. They suffered horrific, agonizing injuries at the water's edge. They were forced to constantly move, to constantly hunt, and to constantly adapt to the terrifying, unpredictable chaos of their terrestrial environment. But it was exactly this constant, painful vulnerability, this ceaseless, desperate struggle for survival that ultimately forged their magnificent resilience. Their profound fear of the dark water, their agonizing physical scars, and their desperate need to adapt to the shifting climate drove them to become faster, leaner, and exponentially more intelligent. They survived the apocalyptic cooling of the planet precisely because they were never completely, perfectly comfortable. They were shaped by their struggles, transformed by their absolute terror, and ultimately saved by their profound ability to change. This incredibly deep geological narrative offers a beautiful, immensely comforting meditation on the true nature of our own human struggles. We often look at the heavy, terrible challenges we face, the deep, agonizing wounds we carry, and the constant, exhausting pressure to adapt to a rapidly changing world as evidence of our fundamental inadequacy. We desperately crave the quiet, absolute, heavy perfection of the terrible crocodile, wishing we could simply sink into the dark, comforting water and remain perfectly, safely unchanged forever. But true, enduring resilience is never forged in perfect, comfortable stillness. It is forged in the freezing wind. It is forged in the desperate, terrifying necessity of moving forward when the landscape around you becomes completely unrecognizable. The magnificent feathered tyrannosaurs standing proudly in the howling Pleistocene blizzard are a spectacular testament to the fact that your current struggles, your profound anxieties, and your deep, heavy scars are actively shaping you into something incredibly powerful, incredibly resilient, and beautifully adapted for the uncertain future. You do not need to be an invincible, heavily armored Leviathan to survive the long, dark winter of your own life. You only need to be willing to learn, to adapt, to cooperate with those around you, and to continuously, bravely move forward through the deep snow. As we slowly, gently approach the final moments of this specific chapter, let the vast, frozen beauty of the alternative Pleistocene wash completely over your tired, overstimulated mind. Imagine the immense, breathtaking silence of the snow-covered steppe stretching infinitely into the dark, starry night. The freezing wind has finally died down, leaving behind a profound, crystalline stillness that seems to completely stop the passage of time itself. The massive, woolly ceratopsians are huddled tightly together in a vast sleeping herd, their immense feathered bodies completely covered in a thick, insulating layer of fresh white snow. They are perfectly warm, perfectly safe, completely supported by the combined comforting presence of their ancient kin. The feathered predators are resting quietly in the deep sheltered valleys, their bright intelligent eyes closed, their incredibly fast metabolism slowed to a peaceful, restorative crawl. The entire ancient world has surrendered completely to the deep, heavy silence of the ice. There is absolutely no need to struggle against the cold tonight. There's no need to fear the shifting currents of the distant future. The ice has covered everything in a blanket of absolute, unbroken peace. Let the chaotic, demanding noise of your modern life be completely buried beneath the soft falling snow. Feel the comforting, heavy warmth of your own bed, a perfectly safe refuge against the freezing winds of the world outside. Allow your breathing to slow, matching the deep, resonant, immensely peaceful respiration of the sleeping giants. Surrender to the vast, quiet beauty of the frozen past, and let the magnificent, silent stillness of the Ice Age carry you gently, softly, and safely into a state of profound, completely undisturbed sleep. As the massive grinding glaciers of the Pleistocene epoch finally began their agonizingly slow retreat roughly 12,000 years ago, the Earth entered its current interglacial period. The crushing weight of the mile-high ice sheets lifted, allowing the deeply scarred continents to rebound and the global sea levels to rise once again, meticulously carving the familiar coastlines we recognize today. North America and South America remained firmly joined by the narrow volcanic isthmus of Panama. The endless Frisian mammoth steppes gradually gave way to sprawling temperate deciduous woodlands, vast undulating prairies of tough grasses, and dense impenetrable tropical rainforests straddling the equator. The geography of this modern alternative Earth is perfectly identical to our own, shaped by the exact same incredibly slow, indifferent tectonic forces. Yet, upon this intimately familiar geographical canvas, a completely alien biological masterpiece is continuously unfolding. There are absolutely no sprawling concrete cities choking the river valleys, no intricate webs of asphalt highways severing the endless migration routes, and no brilliant artificial lights violently erasing the ancient starry night. The world is perfectly, terrifyingly wild, utterly dominated by the spectacular descendants of the Cretaceous giants who have now successfully survived for over 230 million years. Before we completely immerse ourselves in the breathtaking, untouched majesty of this modern alternative present, I must gently break the quiet rustling of the prehistoric leaves. I am Frank, the archaeologist, your dedicated companion and quiet observer on this long meditative voyage through the infinite possibilities of deep time. As we cautiously step into this pristine, untamed modern epic together, I want to gently mention that our most recent analytics reveal that exactly 71.9% of the brilliant, curious minds who listen to these contemplative journeys have not yet subscribed to the channel. If you find profound comfort in these slow, highly detailed explorations of what might have been, and if this quiet, shadowy sanctuary helps you effectively disconnect from the frantic, exhausting pressure of our deeply modified modern world, please consider taking a brief moment to subscribe. It is a very simple, incredibly helpful gesture that supports this work immensely, allowing me to continue unearthing these magnificent, relaxing stories for you week after week. Thank you sincerely for your wonderful continued presence. Now, let us silently observe the magnificent, undisturbed rhythm of a planet where the asteroid missed and the ancient dynasties never surrendered their heavy sovereign crowns. In the vast, sprawling temperate grasslands of what we would naturally call the North American Great Plains, the biological legacy of the Ice Age is spectacularly evident. The magnificent woolly ceratopsians of the frozen Pleistocene have miraculously adapted to the warming global climate by slowly shedding their thick coats, revealing heavily scarred, impenetrable armored bodies that easily rival modern elephants in their sheer, earth-shaking bulk. They move gracefully across the endless sea of tall, vibrant green grass in thundering herds numbering in the millions, their massive beaks effortlessly cropping the incredibly tough vegetation like an unstoppable biological tide. Shadowing these immense, seemingly invincible herds are the undisputed masters of terrestrial strategy, the highly intelligent, fully feathered descendants of the legendary tyrant lizard king. These sophisticated predators, meticulously refined by tens of millions of years of brutal evolutionary pressure, no longer rely on overwhelming, crushing size to secure their sustenance. They are perhaps 20 feet long, possessing an incredibly sleek athletic build and a highly developed, deeply folded cerebral cortex that facilitates a level of sophisticated social cooperation previously unseen in terrestrial carnivores. They hunt in perfectly synchronized, fiercely loyal packs, completely outsmarting their heavily armored prey through sheer intellectual superiority and unmatched physical endurance. Yet, the true intellectual pinnacle of this alternative modern world belongs to a much smaller, far more elusive creature, perfectly hidden within the dense temperate forests. These are the remarkable descendants of the Cretaceous troodontids. These small, incredibly agile theropods possess the largest brain-to-body mass ratio of any terrestrial animal in this vast alternative history. They are elegantly covered in intricate plumage that perfectly camouflages them against the dappled light of the complex forest floor. They have painstakingly evolved highly dexterous hands capable of manipulating physical objects with astonishing precision, allowing them to utilize simple tools such as heavy stones to crush hard seeds, or long, flexible branches to carefully extract burrowing insects from the deep soil. They live in deeply social, multi-generational communities, intentionally passing down learned behaviors and intricate hunting strategies from parent to offspring. They are incredibly smart, possessing an intelligence that easily rivals the most advanced primates of our own timeline. However, this profound intelligence is entirely practical, completely bound to the immediate brutal necessities of physical survival. They do not look up at the vast starry cosmos and wonder about their profound philosophical place within it. They simply exist, their brilliant minds fully engaged with the rich sensory immediacy of the living forest. And what of the ancient silent shadow? What of the terrifying, massive sovereign that once ruled the continent-spanning waterways of the sweltering Eocene epoch? The terrible crocodile and its immense heavily armored descendants, banished to the equator by the advancing ice sheets, have found permanent, humid sanctuary in the steaming, hyper-humid tropical river basins of the alternative Amazon and the vast Congo. In these dense, impenetrable jungles, where the heavy green canopy completely blocks the burning sun, the old, brutal world has miraculously survived almost entirely unchanged. Here, the warm, slow-moving, heavily sedimented rivers still harbor cold-blooded leviathans of absolute, incomprehensible proportions. They have absolutely not needed to evolve complex social structures, nor have they required the desperate development of a highly folded cerebral cortex to survive the changing epochs. The incredibly simple, brutal, perfect mathematics of their ancient ambush strategy remains completely flawless. They still lie perfectly, terrifyingly still in the dark, opaque water, their massive, scale-covered bodies completely supported by the heavy, silent currents. The deeply encoded ancient terror of the dark water persists across the globe, a permanent invisible boundary that the brilliant tool-using theropods and the swift pack hunters intimately know they must never cross. The brilliant intelligence of the dry land completely respects the silent, brutal patience of the deep water. This incredibly wild, undisturbed modern Earth presents a profound, deeply humbling paradox for the exhausted human observer. We have culturally conditioned ourselves over millennia to falsely believe that conscious, contemplative intelligence is the ultimate predetermined goal of biological evolution. We look proudly at our sprawling, glowing cities and our incredibly complex digital technologies, declaring ourselves the triumphant, inevitable apex of life on planet Earth. But the alternative timeline whispers a remarkably liberating truth into the ancient wind. The vast universe is utterly, beautifully indifferent to our desperate existential questions. Biological evolution possesses absolutely no final destination, no grand narrative arc leading inevitably to a creature that builds massive telescopes. The brilliant troodontids and the massive, infinitely patient crocodiles of this alternative present are absolutely not failures merely because they never invented agriculture. They are magnificent successes simply because they exist, perfectly woven into the complex, brutal tapestry of their natural, unbroken ecosystems. They live their incredibly rich, vibrant lives entirely without the heavy, crushing burden of existential meaning, free from the relentless human necessity to constantly justify their own right to breathe. As we gently prepare to let this breathtaking vision of an alternative Earth fade into the peaceful shadows of our resting minds, allow this profound lack of existential burden to completely wash over you. We spend our incredibly brief, frantic lives searching for a grand purpose, carrying the exhausting weight of our own consciousness. But in the quiet heart of the untamed forest, and in the dark depths of the tropical river, there is absolutely no desperate need for meaning. There is only the simple, beautiful, profound act of being. Surrender your deep, exhausting need for purpose to the heavy, dark water. Let your anxious thoughts dissolve completely into the warm, humid air of the deep past. You do not need to figure everything out tonight. You only need to breathe, to simply exist, exactly as you are. Let the profound stillness of the wild planet hold you safely, and allow the gentle, incredibly peaceful heartbeat of the silent earth to carry you slowly and securely into a state of profound, uninterrupted sleep. As the deep velvet darkness of the night slowly descends over the sprawling, untouched temperate forests of this alternative year 2026. A profound, heavy silence settles across the wild planet. The constellations, slowly wheeling across the crystal clear, unpolluted sky, are exactly the same familiar patterns of ancient starlight that have guided our own human ancestors for millennia. The massive, pale moon casts its cold, indifferent silver light over the endless canopy of towering, deciduous trees and the dark, meandering rivers that cut through the silent landscape. In this specific, incredibly peaceful moment, the fundamental reality of the universe is laid completely bare. There are absolutely no satellites blinking in the upper atmosphere, no distant hum of commercial aircraft cutting through the clouds, and no faint glow of artificial illumination lingering on the dark horizon. The Earth is exactly as it has always been for the past 230 million years. A brutal, beautiful, perfectly balanced terrarium of biological struggle and quiet, instinctual triumphs. The highly intelligent, feathered troodontids are sleeping safely in their complex woven nests high in the ancient branches, their brilliant problem-solving minds resting peacefully without a single thought of the cosmos above them. The massive, heavily armored descendants of the terrible crocodile are perfectly still in the warm, dark equatorial waters, their incredibly slow hearts beating a silent rhythm in perfect harmony with the ancient, turning earth. Before we completely dissolve the final boundaries between our own frantic reality and this deeply peaceful, alternative timeline, I must step from the shadows one last time. I am Frank, the archaeologist, your incredibly grateful guide through these vast, contemplative oceans of deep time. As we bring this monumental journey to its quiet close, I must gently share that exactly 71.9% of the wonderful, curious souls who travel with us are not yet officially subscribed to the channel. If you have found a deep restorative sanctuary within these long, slow explorations of the ancient past, and if this quiet space helps you gently drift away from the overwhelming demands of the modern world, please consider taking a brief moment to subscribe. It is a profoundly simple gesture that provides immense, vital support for this channel, allowing me to continue weaving these relaxing, philosophical tapestries for you. Thank you for your beautiful continued presence. Now, let us return to the quiet, starlit forest and confront the beautiful, haunting paradox that lies at the very heart of this entire thought experiment. Here is a deeply strange, profoundly unsettling thought to sit with as you lie comfortably in the dark. If you are listening to my voice right now, if you are actively hearing these words and imagining this spectacular world where the dinosaurs survived, then the massive asteroid absolutely did hit the Earth 66 million years ago. That is the fundamental, inescapable paradox of this speculative journey. The very act of imagining a world where the giant reptiles survived requires a uniquely conscious mind, capable of deep imagination and abstract thought. And that specific storytelling mind, your mind, exists solely because the dinosaurs perished in a global apocalyptic firestorm. Human intelligence is not some predetermined endpoint of biological evolution. It is a staggering contingency, a highly improbable accident, the incredibly lucky result of a chaotic sequence of events that officially began with a 10-kilometer mountain of iron violently shattering the established ecological order of the late Cretaceous period. If that jagged rock had missed our fragile blue planet, there would be absolutely no one here to wonder what might have been. The alternative timeline certainly produced intelligence. The descendants of the troodontids developed remarkable cognitive abilities, mastering complex social dynamics and intricate tool use. But human-level consciousness, the intelligence that actively contemplates its own existence and feels an aching wonder at the vast cosmos, emerged from a completely different set of environmental pressures. Our early primate ancestors spent tens of millions of years in the dense canopies of Africa. When severe climate change eventually forced them onto the dangerous expanding savannas, they faced entirely new selective pressures that fiercely rewarded intense social cooperation, complex vocal communication, and the profound ability to plan for the distant future. Our massive, energy-hungry brains expanded dramatically, driven by a unique evolutionary feedback loop that occurred absolutely nowhere else in the known history of life on Earth. Every single step of that incredible hominid journey was completely contingent upon 1,000 chaotic variables. The brilliant spark that lifted our ancestors from clever apes to philosophizing humans might never have occurred within any dinosaur lineage, regardless of how many hundreds of millions of years they were granted. They could easily have produced magnificent creatures that thought quickly and creatively, but perhaps never a creature that stopped to wonder exactly why it was capable of thinking. But here is the deeply comforting truth that I want to gently leave you with tonight. The absolute absence of human-style intelligence does not make this alternative, wild world lesser. We have a heavily biased tendency to falsely assume that the universe is desperately waiting for us to observe it, to aggressively assign meaning to its silent expanse. We mistakenly believe that a planet without a conscious observer is somehow a wasted planet. But the natural world does not require an audience to be magnificent. The alternative Earth we have slowly constructed together tonight is a world of staggering complexity and brutal, untamed beauty. The massive, heavily scarred tyrannosaurs moving like silent ghosts through the freezing blizzards of the Pleistocene, the thundering herds of woolly ceratopsians flowing like living rivers across the infinite steppes, the giant 50-foot crocodilians ruling the dark estuaries with terrifying patience. This magnificent pageant of biological survival played out on a global stage that remained undisturbed for over 230 million years. That beautiful, brutal world would not need us to appreciate it. It would simply be, exactly as our own world simply is, a fragile, incredibly complex sphere of water and rock, completely covered with living things, each one the magnificent product of billions of years of relentless evolution. The dinosaurs were absolutely not evolutionary failures, because they never learned to build massive cities or launch rockets into space. They were spectacular, completely unprecedented evolutionary successes precisely because they managed to utterly dominate the terrestrial biosphere for 165 million years, and they would have flawlessly continued to do so if the cosmos had not violently intervened. There is a deep, profound, incredibly liberating peace to be found in completely accepting this lack of inherent, human-centered purpose. Imagine a vast, beautiful world that simply exists without the heavy, crushing burden of existential meaning, without the endless, exhausting human need to constantly understand, relentlessly explain, and fiercely justify every single moment of existence. A deeply peaceful world where life simply lives, breathing slowly and steadily, completely in tune with the ancient rhythmic turning of the planet, without ever once asking what it is all for. The giant asteroid struck the shallow waters, the magnificent dinosaurs perished in the suffocating darkness, and here you are, exactly 66 million years later, lying quietly in the dark, listening softly to a strange, lingering story about a wild, ancient world that never actually was. But as you slowly drift toward the comforting, heavy shores of sleep, perhaps you can allow yourself to truly imagine it one last time. Feel the warm, incredibly thick darkness of a pristine Mesozoic night wrapping gently around you. Listen closely to the faint soothing sounds of massive, magnificent creatures moving slowly and deliberately through the ancient, towering forest. Look up at the completely unpolluted, brilliantly starry sky wheeling silently overhead. It is the exact same moon, the exact same slow, indifferent dance of the vast cosmos that completely does not care what walks beneath it. In that deeply peaceful, alternative world, something incredibly ancient and powerful is sleeping right now. Some magnificent descendant of the tyrant lizard king or the terrible crocodile is curled safely in the dark, its eyes softly closed, its breathing slowing to a deep rhythmic crawl, its brilliant, quiet mind dimming toward absolute, unbroken rest. Two incredibly different worlds, two vastly divergent timelines, yet the exact same peaceful, heavy night is gently falling over both of them. The ancient dinosaurs never once asked why they existed. They never worried about the heavy falling rocks from space or the infinite, dizzying alternative histories that might have quietly unfolded. They simply lived, they breathed, and they rested. Surrender your own heavy, demanding thoughts to that same ancient, thoughtless peace. Let the vast, quiet beauty of the wild, unobserved earth carry you gently, softly, and safely into a state of profound, eternal, incredibly peaceful sleep.